My guest tonight is Joachim Hagopian. He returns to the show to discuss his latest article, Western State-Sponsored Terrorism, False Flags Spreading, Islamophobia, Race and Religious Wars, and New World Disorder. Joachim is a West Point graduate and former U.S. Army officer. After leaving the military, he earned a master's degree in clinical psychology and worked as a licensed therapist in the mental health field for 25 years. He now focuses his attention on U.S. foreign policy, international relations, and the various intrigues of the deep state. His blog is American Empire Exposed. Joachim, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, Tim. Yourself?
Very good. Thank you for coming on the show again tonight to discuss this great article you wrote. It's very long, well, relatively long, 14,000 words, long for an article, but it covers a lot of ground, and you kind of connect the dots and provide an analysis of the various terrorist events or perhaps false flag events and geopolitical intrigues that are behind them. Going back for a few decades. How do you want to get into this topic?
Oh, well, we can talk about the Project for a New American Century. That kind of, I think, became the blueprint for the 911s that followed.
And that was the organization that I guess it was began in late 90s, 1997?
Yeah. It started in '97, and the actual report on the transforming American defense came out in 2000, the same year, of course, that Bush and Cheney stole their first presidential election, thanks to the Supreme Court and Jeb's state of Florida, his brother's state of Florida, that gave him the election illegally through fraud. But yeah, they were able to hijack the presidential executive office, and then they did their little number, and it's all written there in their Project for a New American Century. They wrote they specified what we need is a new Pearl Harbor, and that's what 911 became. Now we should actually go back to 1993 with the very first attack on the World Trade Center. Because that's really the predecessor to 911, the one that brought the Twin Towers and Building 7 down. So yeah, I guess that's probably even a better place to start, would be the 1993 World Trade Center bombing.
And that was the incident, I guess it was in February of that year. That's when there was a truck bomb placed in the basement of one of the towers, and
Yes.
it was revealed that it was a FBI sting operation, correct?
Sure was. Yeah, the FBI was in control of that one, and they had an informant who had been an Egyptian military officer who was acting as their paid informant, Mr. Salem, and he was the designated infiltrator who was able to get into the group, this terrorist group alleged, that was making bombs to take out key buildings in New York City. One of them, of course, was the World Trade Center tower, and he was very close to actually. There was the plan for him to, instead of putting in explosive powder into the making of the bomb, they were going to put in a non-explosive powder that would, of course, have no effect on any kind of lethal damage. And just when it came time for him to slip in this benign substance into the bomb making, apparently someone in the chain of command in the FBI office of New York City called the whole thing off. And of course, we now know what happened. Shortly after that, the bomb did go off, destroying $500 million worth of damage in the World Trade Center building, and killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 people. And this gentleman, the FBI informant, Mr. Salem, was so shaken up by and grief stricken over he felt responsible for it going off because he was the one that could have prevented it. And but he was very upset and angry at the New York FBI office. And of course, he had his FBI handlers, and one of them was a woman FBI agent who was saying, "Oh well, they just don't listen." It was like good cop, bad cop, and she was the good cop trying to console him. He actually was really determined to take it to the FBI headquarters in Virginia, and so I think it was the supervisor. I think his name is Ansari. Came to him and said, "Well, the New York office really wouldn't want it to go to Washington, so we're going to hold off on that." And so, yeah, what it did though is because we know that it was involved centralized command. And something as major as this, of course, would have to be run by the top echelons of power in Washington, which include, of course, not only the headquarters of the FBI, but of course the President of the United States, of course. Um, and uh, the President of the United States, 1 month removed, he left in January of '93, was none other than ex-CIA director and the globalist of all globalists, outside of maybe Kissinger. Um, was George H.W. Bush, 1 month removed from presidential office. So the whole sting operation was under his command, and and so, yeah, he had everything to do with it, just like he had his part in the whole 9/11 and the Iraq War and all of the rest. So, yeah, that was the first one, and they got away with that because outside of an obscure article that was noticed by a few people, but not enough, obviously. On October 28th of 1993, New York Times, mainstream media, actually ran an article explaining that it was in fact an FBI sting operation that didn't go forward, and they quoted Mr. Salam in that article, and so yeah, it came out, but then of course it didn't really make any kind of impact for any kind of follow through. There was another one, and in all of these false flag operations, there's always insiders who are basically terrorists, but they're allowed to go scot free because they're insiders. They work with the government, and therefore they want the ones that are closest to the government sources to be free and away from any kind of uh, further recrimination or further questioning, further interrogation. So there was actually another terrorist involved who was able to go back to Iraq. Eventually, Saddam smartly put him in prison. A terrorist belongs in prison, and 60 Minutes was able to actually do an interview, and this is like I think in 2000, just before 9/11, and 60 Minutes did an interview, and they called it "The One Who Got Away." And it turns out that this guy was part of that sting operation. And then there's a quote in there saying, "But he was so cooperative and handed over so many names and addresses that we let him go." I mean, this is how our government operates. They will, work with terrorists. They'll have their patsies, who are the ones that are, of course, blamed, but they're almost always dead after the so-called terrorist acts, and dead man can't talk. So that's their whole basis. And then they let other ones go because they're too close to the government, and of course, the government wants to distance itself after every false flag, to silence any kind of truth coming out about the government's involvement. And in fact, the government is behind all of them. And so, yeah, that was a sad run up to the big 9/11. where they actually did destroy the World Trade Center and Building 7 as well.
And of course, in the 1993 case, the FBI took credit for cracking the case that in a plot that it itself had cooked up.
Yeah, they were able to hone in real fast on those culprits, and within a year, actually, they were tried and convicted, and they were given all this kind of accolades. Oh, such great work! Yeah, you're the insider that did it, so you better know about it.
And despite being complicit in the attack, no FBI agent was ever held responsible, indicted, much less even demoted for their involvement in it. In fact, they were probably promoted.
Right. Yep.
So,
yep.
In the article, you cite, going to motive here. I think you quote Ted Gunderson, the late FBI agent.
Yeah,
that
renegade.
Yeah, yeah. There's still some question what his role in all this is, but that's a whole nother podcast, I think.
Yeah.
But
yeah, he's surrounded by some controversy. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, because involved in COINTELPRO and all that stuff. So yeah, you can always wonder. But I guess he was the former director of the LA FBI field office. But he believed that the CIA and FBI are ultimately responsible for most terrorist attacks. But in the article, you say that in the 1980s, a DOJ attorney told him that anti-terrorism legislation would have to pass, but more people would have to die. People will have to be killed for this to pass. The official told him.
Yeah, one of the attorneys that authored the original Patriot Act way back in the 80s. This is how long in advance they had been planning, basically the New World takeover of our democratic republic. They were stripping all the civil liberties away way back in the 80s. That's pretty amazing. And basically, this woman said, yeah, there's going to have to be more people dead before they ever pass this one. And then the litmus test became the World Trade Center bombing of 1993, where only a half dozen of human innocent lives were lost. And, it didn't go anywhere in Congress. So, her words turned out to be rather prophetic, sadly.
But then 2 years later, we have the Oklahoma City bombing, allegedly carried out by Timothy McVeigh
right.
and Terry Nichols.
That's right.
Now, I think people who've researched that have blown, pretty much blown apart the official narrative of that event.
Of course, yes, that was a huge false flag. Yes,
because the FBI's involvement in that was, of course, it had something to do with the PATCON program, which is Patriot Conspiracy. How they were infiltrating these militias and trying to stir up trouble throughout the country to justify, one thing to justify the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms budget and also their own budget, but also to marginalize these groups and to the politics of the mid '90s. These groups were gaining some traction with the criticism of the Clinton administration, and people who've looked into the Oklahoma City bombing found there was a whole lot of trouble with the official narrative, and that there's a lot of evidence of foreknowledge and their infiltration of Elohim City, and the mountain evidence that suggests that Timothy McVeigh was some sort of intelligence operative.
Yeah.
And
he served in the first Gulf War, and he wasn't in military intelligence while he served. And yes, he was definitely, I believe, an FBI asset. CIA, FBI. He in very, very, very deep. And also was the second guy that got away too.
Yeah, the John Doe number 2, which they put an APB for, and just kind of disappeared down the memory hole. The fact that none of the videotapes that they had on Timothy McVeigh were used in his trial, because apparently there's some question whether it was he that rented the truck, and there's also the involvement of Straussmeyer, the German and Western intelligence asset.
Yep.
And so this was some sort of COINTELPRO operation, much like 1993. It looks like it was instigated, and one of these typical FBI sting operations that we've come to know and love in recent years that are that Trevor Aronson writes about in the Terror Factory, and that's what it appears to
Yeah.
would have occurred there. But then that was sort of a strategy of tension there, where that was the pretense to get a domestic anti-terrorism law passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we have here is like we have the government has reined in on two major target populations. Obviously, this article I wrote is focused on the one, which is the Muslim. So it's a war on Muslim or Islam using patsies
Mm-hmm.
that are paid assets, most often, I believe, of the intelligence forces. And then the other target population, of course, is homegrown domestic terrorism. And so they're going after, and that umbrage includes dissidents. You don't even have to be a plotter of some kind of terrorist act. All you have to do to be labeled in that big umbrella is be a dissident, disagree with the deep state, and you are being criminalized as a potential terrorist. And so we've seen this process unfold, particularly since 9/11. But and in recent years, you know they have interviews with the domestic Homeland Security secretaries, and they're all hyping it up. They're all saying, "Oh yeah, these domestic terrorists are more of a threat and danger to us Americans than those Muslim terrorists." I mean, they're and it's obvious what they're doing. They've created and financed, trained, and blah 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 the Muslim terrorists for a long time. So they're not going to out them and say, yeah, they're the bad guy because they're basically paid allies, mercenary, proxy war mercenaries. So they're using them for an instrument of chaos around the world for destabilizing the entire world, basically. And meanwhile, they declare war on anybody who disagrees with the totalitarian regime tactics and declare them as potential homegrown terrorists, so they can all be locked up too. So they basically make sure that they falsely accuse the two populations that unfortunately a lot of people don't get it. And sure, there are a few, probably a handful of hardcore militia types that are so anti-government that they got their guns and they're ready for the battle and the whole bit. Um, but they so overplay it and over exaggerate to make sure that they're able to convince the American population that their lives are in peril and therefore we need more security. Like more security actually gets the results, because all we've seen with more surveillance and more authority in them to strip away all our rights is more acts of terrorism that they themselves do. So, it's not working, obviously, and it's not working by design. But go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, you had a quote here by former CIA officer David Steele. He had this said during an interview regarding false flag
Yeah,
events.
actually, I have to correct that. His name is Robert David Steele. For some reason, my source only said David Steele, but his
Okay,
name's
Robert
Robert
David Steele.
David Steele. Yes.
And he was a 20-year military career, Marine Corps military intelligence officer and CIA officer. He says most terrorists are false. Most terrorists are false flag terrorists, or are created by our own security services. In the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag, or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism. We've become a lunatic asylum, and that's what's happening. They they aggressively recruit these people with money, blandishments, or even threats to get them involved in these supposed plots. The moment they can, get them to do something or get some sort of pretext for an arrest, they arrest the person and make a big show of it in the media.
Yeah.
Yeah. And inevitably, it's always it was aspirational, not operational. So, as they always say about these attacks, so then because they never demonstrated real capacity for these people to carry out any attacks, So
Right.
they set them up. These people, whether it's at a mosque or these marginalized individuals, they have no money or something. They can get them arrested. And they did, it's not just Muslims. They arrested that guy in Ohio last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's one of these homegrown terrorists, I guess, that they talk about all the time.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but in the article,
Yeah.
you talked
It's
about.
interesting
Sorry, go
that
ahead.
they take a CIA career guy and then the FBI director of the Dallas and New York and LA offices, both longtime career men in their respective intelligence fields, and they both are basically saying all these jobs are inside jobs by our own government committing these terrible false flag acts of terrorism. So I mean, to me, that's pretty strong evidence right there. Never mind looking at each case and see all the holes and the discrepancies from the official dialogue and the official narrative.
And the sad thing is that the judicial system, the courts, don't look at these cases and throw them out. They actually convict these poor people, throw them in prison for 20, 30 years.
Right,
In
right.
most of these cases. The judiciary has really dropped the ball, but then again, the judiciary is just part of the government, so what can you expect, really? So,
Right.
but in the article, you mentioned going back to the World Trade Center 1993. We mentioned Oklahoma City, but you also had the Balkan Wars in the 90s and the use of Al Qaeda as a proxy force
Yeah,
in the 90s, and that served a
yeah,
lot of function there. How they destabilized the Balkans, particularly Yugoslavia, in the early 90s, the mid 90s, and that culminated in the 1999 war. But throughout that process, you had whether you had Al Qaeda forces or jihadist forces being recruited to fight that war on behalf of, I guess, the Kosovo was breaking away
yeah,
from Serbia,
yeah.
and
Yeah, I think it's really important for Americans to realize how many years that our U.S. government has been employing Al Qaeda slash ISIS or Daesh, whatever you want to call them. But they've been employing terrorists for many, many decades. It's now almost 4 decades long where we have created and employed on an ongoing basis every single decade since basically 1979 was the official term with Brzezinski and Vice President to be H.W. Bush. They brought in Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to fight Russia, the Soviets, in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, and it was successful there. And then they continued it in the next decade in the Balkans to balkanize, break up from this major country called Yugoslavia that wasn't cooperating with the totalitarian push of our foreign policy. And that's what happens. Anytime a government stands up to American hegemony, they become the victims of usually some kind of either military or economic sanction threats to try and force them to succumb to the total exploitation, raping, I say all the time, raping and pillaging of their country using slave labor, if anything, and they destroy these countries. The World Bank moves in, the IMF, they get the countries in total debt. But this is what happens to the countries that cooperate. But those that don't cooperate, there's usually war in those countries. The CIA will make sure that there's war. There'll be overthrows, coups, assassinations. This is our foreign policy. And we use these terrorists as our proxies all the time. And we've been doing it now for a long time. So for over 20 years, by the time 911 came around, we'd been using these guys, the Al Qaeda, as our little proxy terrorists. So of course, if you're going to use them as proxy mercenary war terrorists, you're going to also use them, in homegrown instances where, they actually commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil. So that's what, in fact, happened with the 911 situation. And again, in the 1993, where we were using them then, too.
Mm-hmm. And regarding Afghanistan, that was Brzezinski's plan in the summer of 1979, I believe early July of 1979, when he submitted the plan to Jimmy Carter to support mujahideen or Islamic radicals in Afghanistan to lure the Soviet Union into a full-scale invasion.
That's right.
And so the narrative that many people thought was the Soviet Union, hungry for global conquest, rolled into Afghanistan on its way to Paris, I guess, or something. The Persian Gulf, maybe. Of course, that became the pretext for CENTCOM, right? And the Joint Rapid Reaction Force. So the whole justification for the Rapid Reaction Force was based on a provocation orchestrated by Brzezinski, the Trilateral Commission CFR guy, Rockefeller. Errand boy.
Yeah, he was a Rockefeller man.
Yeah. So much of, and of course there was a Rapid Reaction Force, which I guess would eventually become CENTCOM, I guess. And over there in the Persian Gulf. So again, it's one of these. It was all based on a false narrative, lies. The invasion was, one thing was to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, they destabilized the Soviet Union, and you've had efforts in the Caucasus and the Chechnya region with the CIA inciting, creating all types of trouble.
Right.
Of course,
the CIA is their agenda is to use the native population as terrorists to stir up trouble everywhere around the globe. I mean, that is their agenda. And if you want to go beyond that and look at every single war that America's ever fought, the false flag premise is always there. In every single war, it's a triggered, pre-planned event to get into war, and they always use false excuses to do it. And if you do your history, you find out every single war is a false flag event, just like every single act of terrorism is a false flag event. They're all orchestrated, pre-planned events by Western government, i.e., U.S. empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just was listening to a podcast talking about the troubles in Ireland and how most of the IRA attacks were British intelligence and military.
That's right.
And vice versa. It was at that level, they just wanted the troubles. They were the source of the troubles. It's a strategy of tension. And just now it's coming
in. MI6, the CIA, and of course, Israel's Mossad. Mm-hmm. Those are the unholy trinity of intelligence forces that have just done their dirty deeds around the globe. It's just horrible what they've done.
Yeah, I was just reading an article today about this. Is another side effect is apparently heroin use in the United States has quadrupled in the past.
Yeah, they're behind that too. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And they say since 2000, now what happened in 2001 that created this huge influx of heroin to the global market?
Yeah, right. We wanted to go after Afghanistan from the beginning, even long before 911.
And what was coming out of?
Of course, everybody knows about that. The little memo that our Wesley Clark got a hold of.
Yeah.
Take down 7 nations in 5 years. That was also part of the Project for the New American Century. Neocon clan put together that little plan to take down all those countries. Of course, Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and Iraq, let's see, I think Sudan was one of them. They've gotten every single one except Syria and Iran, basically. They're still left on that list. And they're still in the crosshairs. The American government has not given up on getting rid of Assad, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, a thread you always see in this, I mentioned the heroin trafficking. Of course, in Vietnam, what was coming out of Vietnam?
That's right.
And that
did the same thing there. Yes.
Yeah, the Golden Triangle, and of course, in the Central American wars, you had cocaine being shipped into the United States, particularly the South Central LA, and that's a whole other story with the Gary Webb and Ricky Ross and A lot of that money there, the money that was sold cocaine funneled back to the Contras at the same time, and also destabilized, much of the black community in the United States. And
Yeah.
it's oddly enough,
Yep. Get them hooked on the drugs. Yep.
yeah, and then
And
a lot of the
going
money
strong.
was funneled was financed these rap recording companies like Death Row, which was used to further destabilize the communities. It really is an octopus when you look into this stuff, and a tangled web when you look into all the connections. But it's fascinating and very disturbing. So we have that occurring but going way as far back as 1979, with stirring up a few Muslims, as Brzezinski called it. In that interview, the French newspaper, he said it was worth it. But another angle that you mentioned here is also just the rank profiteering we have here, is because all those that are perpetrating these crimes and engaging in these false flag events, they're all also cashing in. Not just the agencies themselves are getting bigger budgets, whether it's the DoD, FBI, or CIA, or wherever Alphabet Soup Agency is involved in this. But you mentioned Michael Chertoff. And he was in a very awkward situation back in the year 2000 when he was both spearheading Operation Green Quest, which was a multi-agency initiative investigating terrorist funding. But in the article, you say he was also defending a suspected terrorist financier.
Yeah, very notorious arms dealer who supplied the terrorists, Osama and company, the Al Qaeda. Mm-hmm. He defended him, got him off, and at the same time was heading this agency that was trying to find out how they fund these terrorists, and let's crack down on these sources here of the funding of terrorists, when the biggest funder of terrorism is the United States government. So who do they put into Homeland Security? This guy that has all these contacts to these terrorist arms dealers. So insane.
And then you have, of course, as the director of Homeland Security, he became, I guess, the second director of Homeland Security after Tom Ridge.
Yeah, I believe he was.
But then he goes on, because he is his lobbying or his PR firm, Chertoff Associates, I think it's called, or he represented.
Something like that, yeah.
He represented the firm Rapiscan, which made these scanners, these radiating scanners that people have to suffer at airports now.
Right.
But then it was disclosed at the very time he was promoting their use as a government official, a former government official. He was also lobbying for their use because he's representing the firm that was ready to make a lot of money selling him to the U.S. government. In fact, they already had sold him to the U.S. government. But it was that incident with the so-called underwear bomber which justified their installation.
Right. He was having trouble with Congress, ratifying this deal, basically. And so he needed to come up with another terrorist event in the air, so he could sell his own, company, basically making billions. And so what do? They come up with the underwear bomber. And that was a whole false flag event right there, where the Nigerian, young Nigerian Muslim, was basically planted with fake bomb in his underwear, apparently. And of course, it didn't go off, but they were able to get a whole public spectacle of this event where he's arrested there at the Detroit airport on Christmas Day. And it turns out that was just a false flag event, so that they could heighten up all the fear and the paranoia amongst the because since 9/11 there hadn't been any kind of air problem with terrorists in the sky, and so of course they wanted to resurrect this whole panic thing, and he gets to sell his equipment, the TSA invasive equipment that radiates our bodies every time we travel.
And that was admitted. The U.S. government admitted to putting that person on the plane as some sort of they admitted some sort of I guess, test operation or sting operation, but they admit to putting him on the plane with some sort of, I guess, flammable device in his pants. They admitted to doing that for Congress.
Yeah, it's very strong evidence that it was all, definitely a government operation. It was. I mean, thankfully, there was a very astute witness that overheard a conversation with basically his handler at the airport, where the guy didn't even have a passport, and then he was granted access on board the plane, without a passport. It was basically a government operation from the very top.
Yeah, that was Kurt Haskell from a lawyer from the
That's
Detroit
right,
area.
Very brave American attorney.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if you ever want to look into that particular event, his testimony, and he has his own podcast show, I believe now. You can find him on YouTube and various interviews where he goes into detail his experience, what he witnessed. A well-dressed, I guess you described it as a well-dressed Indian man.
Yes.
Putting him on the plane. Of course, the bomber himself was a son of a Nigerian banker or central bank official or something.
I think he was, yes.
A prominent family member, yeah.
He came from a family of means, definitely, yes.
So, yeah. Another example you cite is how Chertoff is now teamed up with Michael Hayden, former NSA director.
The NSA director during 9/11. Yeah, an insider. And they're partners now in their security firm, doing all this highfalutin consulting to the government, making millions and billions.
So they're out, stirring up, creating the mess and cashing it. Problem, reaction, solution, I guess.
That's right.
The cash in on it.
Yep, you can call them the Hegelianites or something,
So really, if we were a nation of laws, instead of making hundreds of millions of dollars on government contracts, chasing phantom terrorists, they'd be charged for violating the Constitution and criminal statutes about surveillance, correct? Because they both admitted to crimes, both Keith Alexander and Michael Hayden.
Yeah. They are all treasonous because they actually created this enemy that supposedly kills innocent people. So they're treasonous. They're murderers for sure, but they're bringing down America. So they have committed treasonous acts. And I would go so far as to say that most of Congress has actually been treasonous in their behavior as well. We have a government right now that's full of traitors that have made it their part of their agenda to actually take down America, and we have no bigger one than in the Oval Office. He's the biggest one of them all, and they all answer to the oligarchs or the so-called ruling elite. They've been in control for centuries of the Western civilization, and because of technology and their authoritarian control that they've been given because of these false flag terrorist events, they have more power now than ever, and they're moving towards the one world government. We all know that one too.
That's what all these wars are about, I guess, or destabilization that's occurring not just in the Middle East, but now apparently Europe with the migration crisis, which stems from the problems in Eastern Europe. I mean, in the Middle East.
Yes, it's all orchestrated, pre-planned events. You can bet that every single major event that goes on has been pre-planned. I don't know that if anything natural has occurred, and even here's the crazy thing. Even so-called natural events like disasters like hurricanes and things like this, they have these basically Tesla-like pulsar scalar weapons now that actually cause hurricanes and earthquakes and all of this too. So and weather modification and so we don't even in droughts like in California. So we don't even know, these so-called natural events, we don't even know if they're actually not being caused by the government. In fact, I would venture to say that most of them are actually being caused as well by the government. So, it's pretty insane.
Yeah, I think it was Nick Beglich, the brother of the senator, the scientist. He's
Yes,
written
in
a lot
Alaska. Yeah.
in HARP, the true operate. They said HARP was shut down. They said they finished their job. I don't know what that means.
Oh, they got other ones, definitely. I mean, and I don't believe for a moment the one in Alaska has been shut down,
Yeah.
but there are other ones operating now too. They've developed, they've basically multiplied and spread their power all over the Earth's surface. So yeah, they have that technology going for them to wreak havoc with nature,
Well, yeah,
basically.
weaponized everything, and that's they weaponized the weather. And if you think that's sci-fi, fantasy talk, I believe in 1977 a UN there was a UN treaty against weaponization of weather.
Yeah,
So, if it's just fantasy, why would you bother having a convention against it? And I'd like all conventions and treaties. I'm sure they, they just ignore it. So,
yeah,
it's a question of what they can. It's not a question of should they can do. It should not a question of what they should do. It's a question of what they can do. And some of the strange weather occurrences. I heard some meteorologists were talking about how their predictability, how they haven't been able to predict weather because they've had weather just shift on them. They don't have a real
yeah.
explanation for. And I heard. Are you familiar with Catherine Austin Fitz?
Oh yes,
Yeah,
yep.
she gave a talk one time. She was talking about the tsunami in 2004.
Hmm.
How I believe it was Indonesia, where she was, she had at the time she was involved in finance and investments and giving advice and all that. And she noticed there was a huge spike in the shorting of Indonesian stock. They're selling it off, and she didn't understand what was happening. And all of a sudden, you had the tsunami hit.
Yeah.
And she's
Yeah, you'll find that there's these very sinister people that are behind all these horrible events. They're making money hand and foot in each way, But yes, you'll find that very common with these terrorist events as well, where they make all this kind of money just prior to the actual
Mhm.
terrorist event.
Now what that would suggest is either they've weaponized an ability, they've developed the capability to create an earthquake or a tsunami, or be able to predict it with such accuracy. But either way, with that intelligence, you can short markets or go long on markets and manipulate, you know, stock markets in a way. That's another form of, I guess you could say, off the books money or just sheer theft. I guess
Sure.
like what
Yeah.
occurred at 9/11.
Insider trading.
Yeah.
I mean, the system is rigged anyway under normal circumstances, but obviously they're able to capitalize on these horrible events by making even more millions and billions. Yeah,
Mhm.
pretty insane.
And yeah, if you have enough influence or enough intel, what's going on, like in another country, you can get the heads up and and invest take the right financial steps and make a lot of money. Look at central banking, what occurs with central banking and the rating of interest rates and the gold prices, what they do with that. I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and of course, you mentioned 9/11 and George Bush's speech on September 11th, 1991, his discussion or his reference to a new world order.
right.
And it was 10 years to the
Yeah,
day of the 2001 attacks. And some researchers have uncovered a project called Project Hammer, which involved, I believe, $240 billion in fraudulent bonds that were used to rob the former Soviet Union. And this involved,
okay.
and what happened, some people think that one of the reasons for the September 11th attacks on 2001 was to create such havoc in the markets to create the excuse to suspend normal certification and regulatory processes, and that allowed those false bonds to be cleared. So you're talking about a
Huh.
quarter of $1 trillion, not to mention what was going on at the Pentagon.
Right,
With the
right.
trillions of missing dollars. So what you get here was there's also been some speculation about a huge gold heist occurring, a la Die Hard
Yeah,
3, right? Um,
yes.
and so again, we get into the big financial scams that occur during these events.
Yeah.
You know, there's been some talk about some of the domestic events occurring here in the United States about some of these, you know, mass shooter events. They tend to coincide with drills, and there's a lot of anomalies that makes many people suspect whether they're even happening at all. They're just kind of fake events that the media uh, portrays to the public. Of course, following these events are usually, you know, tens of $1 millions in payoffs. And there's
That's
also
right.
I did an interview with Sophia Smallstorm. She talked about how a lot of these events provide a justification for all types of funding for these local departments and grants that kick in, military.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of money involved. And when you have a lot of money involved, there's a great potential there for fraud and malfeasance and duplicity. So it's not beyond the, you know, the realm of possibility that these events are being staged just to steal a whole lot of money. You know,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I mean, they serve several functions, obviously to move us closer to one world government, to create wars, fear amongst the population. But also, of course, it's money-making operation. You have the growth of homeland security in and of itself. I mean, it's like employs something like upwards of almost 20% of our population now is in some way connected to basically security, national security. So it's all self-serving. They're self-replicating. They want to grow, 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 and it's at the expense of us, basically,
Mm-hmm.
literally.
Yeah, because there's no all that's parasitical. It's not real economic growth. It's not value added. It's actually value subtracted. Because
Yes.
it's at best it's make work jobs, but at worst, what they're doing, they're creating at the same time they're creating all these boondoggles. They're slowly eroding and doing away with the traditional civil liberties and constitutional rights that we used to take for granted in this country, that protected us, that actually made this country exceptional in many ways. They've
Yeah.
destroyed that in the
Yeah.
process. Um, but the with all that money going into these these programs, you get, like you said, you mentioned there's these so much now is dependent on that money. And how do you stop that? How do you unwind that once it begins? It metastasizes and takes on a life of its
Yes.
own. You know.
Yes.
So, but again, with 9/11, in the article you talk about who was involved in that, and one aspect of 9/11 which doesn't get a lot of attention, which I think you can make a good case for, is the Israeli involvement. We heard a lot about the Bushes and the Bin Ladens, and the fact that they were business partners, and how the Bin Laden family were flown out of the country in the week after 9/11. But
Right. Yeah.
there's the Mossad connection here, which
Yeah.
do you want to get into that a little bit?
Sure. I think basically what the neocons did is they handed over the operational aspect of 911 to Mossad, the CIA of Israel, and so they basically, I mean, we have all kinds of evidence of they took out a floor in one of the towers and were busily. This is like maybe 6 months in advance of 911. They had been busily stockpiling explosives, and of course we also the truthers have one thing in common, even though there's a split on actually how those buildings went down and all of that. But the one thing in common is that it was a demolition. I mean, they went down in a demolition form. Now, the actual speculation of whether there was a scalar weapon involved too, to create the dust that Dr. Wood, Judy Wood, her camp basically says. And then there's the architects and engineers that are on the other side saying that the rubble was spread out over a larger area, and it wasn't like just pure dust vaporized by some kind of scalar weapon, but it was a planned demolition. But anyway, what we have here in the Mossad is that they basically were able to be in charge of the whole operation of taking down the buildings, and so we have these van loads of Mossad agents basically driving away from the scene. Basically, they were in the process of trying to blow up. It was actually much bigger planned event, that it wasn't going to just include those three buildings of the World Trade Center. It was also to blow up the George Washington Bridge, and they were going to be blowing up offices of the CIA, um, uh, and the Holland Tunnel was also involved in this. So thank God that the other planned events didn't get to happen. Actually, we're fortunate in that regard. But but yeah, these Mossad agents were actually arrested. There were basically dogs that were able to sniff out their van, and there was evidence that actually there were explosives, residue powder, explosives in the van that they were also documented. And yet, mysteriously, after being detained for a very short time, they were allowed to go free. Yeah, you have to wonder about that, because it was from the very top that they were allowed to be, go back to Israel. And then they were on a show bragging about their exploits. Pretty incredible. And then there was another incident, in Pennsylvania, where this is like probably 3 weeks after 9/11, and then these guys were picked up by local police in Pennsylvania, and then they discovered these videos inside their van of the Chicago Sears Tower, and zoom up close-ups of all that. And this is like 3 weeks after the World Trade Center towers went down. So they were held, and all of a sudden, the call to the headquarters in Washington, and they're free. So I mean, over and over, these guys that are part of Mossad, that were the real perpetrators of the actual operational aspect of the blowups, they were all allowed to go free. There was actually a group in Fort Leavenworth of 60 military officers, Army officers, who actually came out with a Washington Times article on September 10th of 2001, basically stating, CIA, you really have to watch them. They have the capability of being able to pull off events and make it look like it's the Muslims. And they actually came out with this article on the day before 9/11. And then their prophetic words were, there it is, within 24 hours. They actually did it, 9/11. And so yeah, there's a whole lot of evidence. There's also evidence that Netanyahu, even before he became president, actually was meeting, and he's so deep in the Mossad and CIA that he actually had made statements that we need to take down America, and through some kind of false flag terrorism. So there's just a lot of evidence that the Israeli connection to 9/11, but a whole bunch of, they have their hand in almost all of it. Seems they certainly were very steeped in the 3/11 Madrid train bombings. But yeah, their fingerprints are all over false flag terrorism,
Well,
along with CIA.
by way of deception, right? So,
Yes, always.
but that was, I think you've referenced, that was the Urban Movers.
Yeah.
With the
Yeah.
van with the emblem of the World Trade Center, with a plane driving, apparently, I think.
Yeah, pretty cryptic there, and you don't have to go too deep to get behind it either. And of course, the famous scene of them at the New Jersey park, jumping up and down, cheers as the buildings fall.
Yeah, that's when they admitted on
yeah,
Israeli TV that they've been sent to film the event.
yeah, yeah,
So okay,
yeah.
foreknowledge.
Incredible.
It was
Yeah.
was it Michael Chernoff who got them released? The dancing Israelis.
It probably was. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't certainly. I mean, he has the power, that's for sure. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and of
And
course,
he's, of course, one of the many neocon dual citizens that obviously has loyalty to Israel.
but yeah, the false flag MO with the Israeli intelligence goes even before the founding of Israel with the Stern Gang and the bombing of the King David Hotel. They originally tried to
Yeah,
blame
1954 in Egypt.
the
Yep,
Von
yep.
affair, yeah. And of course the USS Liberty, which you want to call that a
That's
false,
right.
U.S. which which U.S. government itself covered up.
Yeah,
And
Johnson.
But more recently, I mean, I was reading Ari Ben Menashe's book, Prophets of War, and he claims the Achille Lauro was a Mossad operation.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, and Victor Ostrovsky, is that the guy who wrote the book? Another Mossad. He claimed that the Kalash Jackal was a Mossad asset. The Mossad knew where he
Yeah,
was all the time. I mean, really, from the standpoint of an intelligence or a military agency, you want these people going out and crazily creating mayhem, and because that provides a justification for your existence. So, really, it's not too hard to imagine why the Mossad would want uh, occasional terrorists running around creating havoc, because what is that drives people into their camp, which is an old strategy. It's a strategy of tension.
right.
And some
Yeah, the old, who's got both the motivation and the means, and Israel, it's, they're guilty on all parts. That's
and
for sure.
just the Charlie Hebdo affair. What did Netanyahu say about that? His reaction was, "Come to Israel. All the Jews should come to. You're not safe here."
Right, right. And,
Yeah.
and the preceding event, oftentimes, with these acts of terrorism and quote unnatural acts of terrorism with the so-called disasters, so often, it's precipitated by some kind of move that Israel or U.S. empire does not agree with. The precipitating event that happened with the first Charlie Hebdo in January of last year was um, was basically France recognizing Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and well, we got to do something about that, and of course they were also moving to basically break with America on sanctioning of Russia. The sanctions of Russia have hurt European nations like France and Germany more than they have Putin's Russia. So that was another thing that pissed the power boys off, Israel and America, was those two things. And then within a month, bam, Hebdo.
And
Yeah.
you had the same. This brings us more recently to the November 13th attacks, and the same type of geopolitical jockeying seems to play here, because those attacks overshadowed what Putin was exposing going on in Syria with ISIS, correct?
That's right.
And also,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's amazing how the timing of these events are so keyed into basically the geopolitical maneuverings that are going on at the time. Just prior, you want to look right ahead of the event, and you can figure stuff out real well. And obviously, the prevailing trends of the last Paris Hebdo attack, I'm not Hebdo, but Friday the 13th attack, was basically Putin stealing the thunder of Obama and his so-called war on ISIS. Where basically it was a fake war. We're there to protect them. They are, the U.S. empire's asset mercenary on the ground, and so since September of 2014, there was basically a lot of bombing going on, but the victims of the bombing were basically the infrastructure of Syria, including a lot of civilian casualties lost in that bombing. But the victims were not the so-called terrorists. They were protecting those terrorists, and so yeah, and then all of a sudden, September 28th and 30th, they're at the UN. Putin comes along and he outs Obama and his fake war against terrorism, and then takes charge in Syria at the request of the legitimate president of Syria, Assad, and so he starts taking over and exposing the whole oil, the pirated oil that's going to both Israel as well as Turkey. And of course, we've seen the pictures that Russia released of the caravans of thousands of trucks daily moving from Syria right into Turkey. And of course, we know how steep Turkey is in ISIS and terrorism as well. And then we have the basically the Russian airliner being taken down on near Halloween, at the end of October. 224 people, Russian people, dead suddenly, and they pretty much have discovered that it's more likely that ISIS may have been able to get access to the plane while it was parked, docked in the Egyptian airport. And then, of course, it just so happens that Israel and America were both involved in a military exercise right very close to the Sinai where it went down. And and then we know that with Friday the 13th, 2 weeks prior, on October 29th, actually the day before the plane went down over the Sinai, we know that Brennan was meeting with the counterpart CIA French intelligence director, along with Mossad, former Mossad director, along with a former consultant of MI6. So we know that this little conference was going on to basically plan for the Friday the 13th event that happened in Paris 2 weeks just prior to the event. And they also, and then we have right after, it was like happened on the Friday, and then Brennan was again interviewed on Monday as the Monday morning quarterback. And he's telling the press, he's saying, yeah, we knew, the intelligence community knew that there was going to be a terrorist attack in Paris, and then come to find out there's a judge that worked for security forces that had actually basically interrogated some probable terrorists inside France. And they had disclosed that there was this plan to go after concert halls in Paris. So they knew everything that was happening. They allowed that drive-by shooting of all those three restaurants. All those three restaurants in Paris. There was a span of about 11 to 12 minutes of just nonstop shooting as they're driving by all these different restaurants, killing, dozens more people. And come to find out, they knew that there was going to be an attack, and yet they allowed free reign where they're able to, drive by for all that length of time, never be stopped, and no cop in sight, and then on out, and then they eventually found it the vehicle a couple of days later. So, I mean, it's also very obvious that the government plays a part in every single one of these events. They get these patsies, they probably pay them, but certainly they're involved, and they have their CIA and Mossad and the French intelligence handlers that are able to work together with them to pull off these terrorist events where they kill hundreds of people. And it happens over and over and over. And until the populations of the West realize that it's their own government that is targeting and killing them, murdering them, their own government. They must realize this in order to then take up action to oppose what the government's agenda is, which of course is to strip away all rights, have an authoritarian, totalitarian regime where we have absolutely no legal rights, no representation, and the government can do whatever they want to the people. They can lock them up indefinitely. They can kill them at will. And there's absolutely nothing that the people can do because there's no rule of law outside of total chaos and murder and mayhem that's been authorized by all these terrorist events. So we got to do something before it's too late. That's why I write all these articles, trying to wake the sheeple up.
Of course, the mainstream media and the coverage of this, they're complicit in all this because at this point, I think anyone who does the research in these things realizes that the networks, the mainstream media, has been totally infiltrated and controlled by the powers that be, the intelligence agencies, because the corporations that run these places are all part of the, I guess you could say, part of the oligarchy. So we can't
Sure.
rely on the New York Times, or can't rely on CNN or Fox News or NBC, ABC, or CBS to do any reporting or, God forbid, any real investigating, asking any questions. They're just there to repeat the narrative, as stenographers. You know.
There's six oligarchs that control over 90% of all the information and news that's
Mm-hmm.
dispersed around the world. So that tells you, it's a very small group of people that are in total control of outflow of information. That's why the internet is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, under martial law conditions, they have their planned agenda to basically take down the internet and make it no longer accessible to the people. Well, we better fight that one too, because without the internet, we won't have any access or source of truth coming to us. We will
Mm-hmm.
not have it anymore.
But a lot of people who are skeptical about, I guess, interpretations of these events as being false flag, they say, well, no, because too many people have to be involved in this stuff to orchestrate a fraud. Well, if you have the media not asking the right questions and you know involved in the fakery, you can get away with it because no questions are being asked. So no,
Sure.
without any questions. And again, if you doubt that, I would say just go on YouTube and watch CNN faking missile attacks during the first Gulf War. You just
Yeah, they're constantly, evidence of how I mean, it's laughable. The mainstream media is just a propaganda ministry for the government, which is, the whole totalitarian, fascist totalitarianism is where the transnational corporations pretty much call the shots of the government. They've already bought and paid for the government, and they're in total control of all mass media, which includes film and TV and music, all of them. All aspects of media are totally controlled and censored and controlled. So the truth is filtered out basically of mass media, and that's
mm,
why basically we're left with and then they have all their implants to infiltrate the even the alternative media, and there's a whole bunch of disinformation going on right there. So to muddle it up so it confuses people and people don't know what to believe. So, yeah, you have to do your homework, folks, basically to find out the truth these days. Don't
yeah,
rely on anybody.
well, yeah, it's full spectrum dominance. They don't want to have any outlet or any medium that can challenge their control, and they've successfully, yeah, as you say, successfully taken over entertainment, news, infotainment, music. Um, some say food, medicine. These things are part of their plan
Yeah.
to achieve. I mean, if you look at the agenda behind vaccines and whether it's the polio vaccine crippling people in Pakistan that Melinda Gates are doing, or it's the soft kill here at home, where a lot of these vaccines are now being blamed for the explosion, autism, cancer rates,
Sure.
going off the roof. Of course, all these things create downstream profits for the medical industrial complex, which you alluded to is part of the military industrial complex, which is part of the oligarchy. So
Yeah.
it's all the same thing. Um,
They have soft kill methods and their hard kill methods. Terrorism and war obviously is their hard kill, but their soft kill, they have quite a arsenal of weapons of mass destruction there. Vaccines being one of them. Chemtrails, where we're breathing in these toxic metals. There's another one. The GMO Monsanto altered foods. There's another one. I mean, it goes on and on. The pollution of the land, air, water, the radiation that's ruined the Pacific Ocean, and the extinction of both the wildlife in the sea, marine wildlife, as well as outside the sea. I mean, we're headed for a sixth extinction. That's where we're headed. And I don't see the powers that shouldn't be changing things. It seems like they seem to be content to have the Earth destroyed. I think they have some kind of contingency plan. We know this, in fact. They have luxury underground houses built underground. They've been working on that since the early 50s, and I believe that they have actually the mindset that they're going to survive whatever happens on the surface that kills off at least 90% of the population. That's been their agenda for a long time too. The eugenics plan. They believe that they're going to survive. They have this transhumanism where they believe that through artificial, organs and these kinds of things, that their life will be eternal for them. That they have this technology to be able to continue on indefinitely, and no matter what happens to the rest of us, they will survive. And we don't know the extent of it. It's basically the black ops and all of this, but we know that they have the capability of colonizing other celestial bodies out there. So they probably have another plan to be out there somewhere in space too, while the Earth pretty much has totally been shot because of it's all poisoned and destroyed. So yeah, they've covered every base basically, so that they have this, I would call it a delusion of grandeur, that they will live forever at our expense because we're all expendable. There's been many quotes by Kissinger and the rest of them that we're useless eaters. And how do you get people to clamor to be locked up? Food. This is another little morsel that Kissinger laid out. Yeah, Brzezinski and Kissinger, they're the along with George H.W. They're the most vocal of the globalists, because they're just they make no bones about it, about their agenda for a one world government, and to have total control over every single person's life that's left alive on the earth. It's real overt.
Well, yeah,
you can't miss it.
Yeah, food as a weapon is an old strategy, and I think it was Kissinger in his National Security Memorandum 200, 1974, talked about using food and also impoverishing the third world in order to control the population, and that was the plan to depopulate, wipe out tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, in order for them to secure control of the resources that they coveted there, and which is an old plan right there. That's part of, you mentioned the IMF and World Bank plan. It's part of the economic hitman model, where they go in and they they buy out the leaders to cover the to enslave the country in debt, and of course the collateral are the country's natural resources. And
they privatize everything, so the transnationals move in. They put them in with all this debt, so they're never going to be able to get out from underneath the debt. The thing is the economic system is about to collapse. I really, of course, people have been saying this for a long time now, but they do all these little Band-Aid effects to kick the can down the road. But I really think that 2016 we're gonna see the ultimate collapse. That's what I'm thinking.
Well, it's certainly not sustainable, and I can't. If you look at it, if economics were the only thing in play here, it would have collapsed long ago. But I think what we're dealing with here, I think is another. I'll reference her again, Catherine Austin Fitz. He said, "What we're really dealing with here is not an economic question; it's a military question." And when they control the satellites, the communications, the clearance systems, the money, and they have the power to kill with impunity, they can keep the system going a very long time, and I guess they can shut it down when it suits them. But it's hard to apply any fundamental economic theory or thinking to the system, because the system is fundamentally rigged and corrupted. So you can't say, well, a dollar is going to crash because they're printing too many dollars. But you can make the rest of the world accept dollars, because you have weaponry that makes people you can keep it going for much longer and continue your plunder. But yeah, it's hard to say when it will collapse, or if it will collapse, or just going to be a kind of a slow burn where they continue just to
Yeah,
rob and rob and rob. But
that's the way it's been. Of course, it's been the slow burn collapse.
yeah, I mean, look at
And
the middle.
it may continue in that vein too. I mean, it doesn't have to be some dramatic,
There's also
like the
the pump and dump.
29th,
There's the
1929.
Yeah, well, there's the pump and dump scam where they jig the market for 5, 10 years. Everyone gets ecstatic and they invest in the stock market. Then they're robbed.
Yeah,
I mean, look at the 2008 crash, right? And all the
right.
principal aid institutions that were primarily responsible for that crash were greatly rewarded. Goldman Sachs,
Bailed out, yes,
yeah,
by the taxpayers.
by the taxpayer, and then those firms get bigger and bigger and bigger, and smaller firms either go under or get absorbed. And that happens in the economy too. Look at the economy, how it's been corporatized and centralized in the United States with these, Walmart and Staples and these national chains that are all owned by a few corporations at the top.
Yeah,
And this
yeah,
has created a concentration in the U.S. economy that has undermined much of the small and mid-sized businesses that historically were the source of upward mobility for the middle class.
right.
And
There
also,
is none.
and the
Yeah,
real competitiveness too in the market, whereas they're destroying real competitiveness in the market.
that's right.
But for these guys, as one great oligarch once said, competition is a sin. So
And of course, since the 2008 crash, they've been gambling money into derivatives, and it's
mhm,
now like quadrillion debt now, and so that's the next thing that's going to blow.
mhm. And that'll be the big excuse to what to do what when that blows. Well, we got to.
Bail in, where they take the money out of private accounts. That's the plan. They've already got it, legislated.
Well, that's what they did in Cyprus, right? That was the
Yes, it's already been done. Sure. Yep.
so. Well, listen, we cover a lot of ground. The article I highly recommend. It's again Western state-sponsored terrorism, false flag spreading, Islamophobia, race and religious wars, and New World disorder, um, by Joachim Hagopian. The takeaway from this article is that everything is interrelated. The illegal wars, the false flag terrorism, the police state measures, financial fraud, the economic meltdown, government corruption, the racial tensions, the migration crisis in Europe, the geopolitical wrangling in the Middle East, Syria, and elsewhere, Ukraine, is all part of a broad agenda called the New World Order, as you flatly stated in the article. The elite or the oligarchs who really rule the world are, through their central banks and intelligence agencies and corporations, they're the ones that control the governments of the world, really. And they're in the process of sowing discord and generating crises, economic and military, in order to impose a new world order, a one world government, out of chaos order, right? And so, listen, is there anything else you want to add before I let you go tonight?
Yeah. Everything has been moving towards centralization. That's their method of control. So the method of decontrol is decentralization. Start locally with building the resources. First of all, you have to start with your own food supply. So get with your neighbors, get with your community, and start with having food co-ops. You have to work at the local level, and if you're going to survive what's to come. And so I really strongly encourage the people to work locally, network with your friends and your neighbors, and become as resourceful as you can. And I think that's going to be part of my focus. I'm exposing a lot of the bad things going on, but I feel incumbent to also talk about some of the good things that are happening now as an alternative to prepare for what's to come. So that's what I have to say. I say decentralize, go local, and build from the ground up to provide the resources that are essential for survival.
That's excellent advice because one of the saving graces of during the Great Depression was that so many people still lived on farms or they lived near
Right.
farms and local economies. They did not need money to get by day to day. money was irrelevant to a lot of people because they needed food, and people were capable of repairing clothes, performing certain tasks, crafts, mechanical work, and farming. So these communities were self-sustaining in many respects, which I think, at least here in the United States, prevented mass starvation from growing. Of course, there was a lot of malnutrition and starvation in the United States during the Great Depression, but it would have been a lot worse if the country had been as it is today, which is 5% agriculture, 95% urban or suburban, and so
Right.
the system really is delicate, and there are the supply chains, the systems of credit and money that the system relies on to get food to your table. If those ever break down, people will really be desperate out there, which is why it's important for them to start acting locally, food co-ops, farmers markets, and these things. And at the very
Yeah.
least, if the great crash doesn't come, you'll be eating better and be healthier because you'll be eating food that isn't
Right.
GMO or processed or
Right.
things like that. So,
And that's how the Russians survived after the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. They were also more agrarian minded.
mhm.
The system by design has made sure that people are so dependent upon their national grocery store chain for their source of food. Well, we got to move away from that, and we have to move away fast if we're going to be able to survive what's coming. So yeah, decentralized, grow your own food. That's healthy anyway. You don't want the processed foods that are at the store anyway.
Yeah, it's good. And also, people are reminded that food does not come from a refrigerator or a grocery store; it comes from the ground. So,
Right,
you know,
right.
and it's interesting with Russia because even the Soviet Union they found that the collective farms were such a disaster that the government turned a blind eye towards small private farms to
Yeah,
fend off starvation. So that became the background of became the unofficial backbone of Soviet agriculture for the better part of 30, 40 years in the Soviet Union. So that's how important
yeah.
it was. So, listen, I want to thank you for coming on tonight, and I
Well,
wish you a
thank you, Tim.
happy New Year and enjoy the South Pacific.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim, and I'll talk to you some other time.
Yeah, sure, we'll do it again. Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye bye.
Good night.